Well, now it's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Condoleezza Rice. And if the term Renaissance person ever applied to anyone, it applies to her. We're all familiar with her public biography. She served as National Security Advisor under President George W. Bush from 2001 through 2005, and Secretary of State from 2005 through 2009, the second woman to hold that position and the first Afro-American woman to do so. Well, Dr. Rice was also the youngest provost at Stanford from 1993 through 1999, and provost is the institution's chief budget and academic officer. And during that time, Stanford was going through some difficult times in balancing its budget, and that was Dr. Rice's role. And as I understand it, she did it with toughness, with openness, with integrity, and with grace. Well, today, Dr. Rice serves as professor of political economy in the Graduate School of Business and professor of political science at Stanford and a fellow of public policy at the Hoover Institution. She has also served on several boards and has a passion for supporting nonprofit organizations like the Boys and Girl Scouts of America. What you may not know is that she's also an accomplished pianist, having played a concert with Yo-Yo Ma, and she's also an athlete. She trained many years as a figure skater. Well, Dr. Rice is also a sports fan, and especially Stanford sports in particular. David Shaw, head coach, is quoted as saying, "She's the best recruiter on campus." Can you imagine being a 17 or 18-year-old and meeting Dr. Rice? How could you refuse to attend Stanford? She's also the author of several books, including her current bestseller, No Higher Honor, and also her autobiography, Extraordinary Ordinary People, a memoir of family, and I highly recommend both books. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Condoleezza Rice.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Good morning. Well, thank you for that very warm welcome. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it's a delight to join you here for this great institution, the Silicon Valley Prayer Breakfast. I've been out of office for now a number of years, and I'm always asked several questions, so I thought I would try to provide an answer. Well, the first question is it different being out of government? Yes, it is. I get up every morning, I get my coffee, I read the newspaper, I think, isn't that interesting? And I go right on to whatever else I want to do because I'm no longer responsible. A second question I'm asked is, do you miss Air Force One? Well, yes, I do. But when you get off of Air Force One, you have to go and negotiate with Russians and Palestinians and Israelis. Air Force One brings certain responsibilities. Sometimes it's just better to fly Southwest. But the third question that I'm often asked, and the one that I'd like to spend some time on today, is how did your faith serve you, affect your decisions, as you went through the challenging times of leadership in your life, whether those times were as provost at Stanford or particularly in the 8 years as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State at some of the most difficult times that our country has faced. And I have to admit to you that that's a much harder question to answer. It's a hard question to answer because in so many ways, my faith is so integral to who I am that it's hard to separate it out and say it has helped me in this way or in that way. Now, for me, it is integral because my faith journey is one that perhaps is common to some of you, but it's a little bit different in that I grew up quite literally in the church. My father was a Presbyterian minister when I was born. Indeed, the day that I was born, November 14th, 1954, I'm 57, so don't start counting. November 14th, 1954 was a Sunday. And my mother had actually gone, had some labor pains that Friday before, and Dr. Plump, who delivered all the black babies in Birmingham, had said to my father, "Oh, Reverend, you go ahead and deliver your sermon. That little child isn't going to be born for a while." Well, Dr. Plump was wrong. My father was in the pulpit when at 11:48, guess who actually showed up? And so the first thing that my father learned when he came out of the pulpit was, as his mother said to him, "Johnny, you have a baby, it's a girl." He said, "A girl?" I was supposed to be named John. I was supposed to be his all-American linebacker. All of a sudden he had a girl, but he loved me as my mother did unconditionally. But I was quite literally born into the church, and we lived in the back of the church until I was 3. And even after that, while my father pastored Westminster Presbyterian Church, the week was not just Sundays at church. It was Tuesdays for tutoring at the church, and Wednesday for choir practice, and Thursday for youth fellowship, and Saturday to prepare, and Sunday. And so the church was very much a dominant force in my life. I can quite honestly say that I don't think I ever in my life have doubted the existence of God. And in fact, that is in part because my father, and I thank him for this, was very careful to raise me in a way in which faith and reason were not enemies of one another. Indeed, he encouraged me to question, to think. My father was famous for kind of controversial sermons, and many of them were about those terrible times for the disciples just before Christ was going to be put to death, the time that we celebrate really and acknowledge now, when, as he said, these ordinary men who had laid down their lives to be with Christ suddenly realized that he was being crucified as a common criminal, and how could they possibly have followed this man, and what did it mean? And those doubts, my father was always one who allowed for the possibility of doubt in faith. And in Faith and Reason, we debated all of the time about the great issues of the church. In fact, our first debates were when I was about 4 years old and came home after one of his sermons and told him that he had mispronounced the name of that man, Job. And why didn't he understand what he was doing? Well, he was a man of faith, and he was my father, and so much of my life we talked about and debated and tried to understand the role of faith. And I'm very grateful to him that faith and reason were never enemies of one another. But you know, even those of us who were born to faith, who never questioned the existence of God, who had faith deeply embedded in us, can get lazy in our faith. And I realized at a point in my life that I had indeed become lazy in my faith. I had moved to California in 1981 to join the faculty at Stanford, and I was traveling a lot as a young professor to all kinds of places around the world, and I always seemed to be in some other time zone, so there was always an excuse not to make church on Sunday morning, something that had been so routine when I was a child that I remember missing church when I had chicken pox at 6 and thinking, boy, this must be serious because we're not going to church. So we went to church all the time, and here I was in the Bay Area for the first time, and I wasn't really going to church. It wasn't really working on my faith, and I wasn't really thinking about it very much. And then one Sunday morning, when I should have been in church, I was in the Lucky's supermarket on Alma in Palo Alto. And I'll never forget, I was in the spice aisle, and there was a man there, a black man, who came over to me, and he said he was there buying some things for his church picnic later on that day. And all of a sudden he looked at me and he said, "Do you play the piano?" And I said, "Yes, I play the piano." And he said, "You know, my church needs somebody who will play the piano for us. Could you come and play the piano for us?" And I thought, the long arm of the Lord into the spice aisle at the Lucky supermarket on a Sunday morning. I guess I'd better go play the piano. But of course, I'm a Presbyterian, And in the Presbyterian Church, not only do we not speak unless spoken to, but we actually sing from a hymnal with notes. And all of a sudden, I found myself in the Baptist church, Jerusalem Baptist, where the minister would start a song and I was supposed to follow. Well, I had played piano from age 3, but I read notes. So I called my mother, who had actually been a church musician in the Baptist church, and I said, Mommy, I said, you know, the minister starts a song and he starts in no known key. What am I supposed to do? She said, honey, play in C. He'll come right on back to you. And sure enough, if you play in C, they will come back to you. Well, that incident of the Lord reaching through Dale into the spice aisle at the Lucky Supermarket convinced me that maybe it was time to reaffirm and to re-engage my faith. And soon I would find a church home at Menlo Park Presbyterian Church, which is still my church home today. I would find it, ironically, on an Easter Sunday when I went to the services there. The first service was too crowded, and so I went into an off room to wait until the second service, and I found myself in the company of a young man who played for the 49ers and his wife, and we were sitting there, and all of a sudden there was a loud thud in a back room. And we got up, and an elderly man had fallen down. He'd had a heart attack. I would learn later during the sermon that he was a longtime member of Menlo Park, a great believer, who had gone on to meet the Lord. And there, on Easter Sunday, was an affirmation of the power of the resurrection and the life. And so I thought, I think this must be where I belong, and I did become a member of Menlo Park Presbyterian. And then I started to understand why the Lord had chosen this moment to help me re-engage my faith, because this was 1982, late in 1982, and a few years later, I would lose my mother, my beloved mother, to cancer, to a reoccurrence of breast cancer that she had had in 1970. She died in 1985. And all of a sudden, I understood something that my father said when I got off the plane from Denver, when I learned that she had died. He said, well, she's with the angels now, and he said, I thank God that he answered my prayer. I thought, Daddy, what are you talking about? Mother's dead. And he told me something that he had not told me at the time. He said, in 1970, when she first got cancer, you were 15. He said, and I prayed, got down on my knees, he said, and I prayed, Lord, please don't leave me with a 15-year-old girl alone. I will know nothing of how to raise her. And he said, he spared your mother for 15 years. And suddenly I realized what a difference. That at 15, I didn't lose my mother. And at 30, as hard as it was, she had seen me grow into a woman, a professor at Stanford, successful. The Lord had answered this prayer in a very unusual way. And then, of course, I would later lose my father, a man of great faith, who not too long before he slipped into a coma told me, I'm going home. And we were at his house. I said, Daddy, you are home. He said, no, I'm going home. And I realized that this man of great faith, who had helped me to build my faith, knew he was going home. And so I think the Lord re-engaged me in my faith so that these personal tragedies were not indeed tragedies, but an understanding of the peace that passeth understanding. And so I would take that solid faith and that re-engagement with me as I went on to Washington, D.C., expecting to have a kind of normal experience. I'd been a student of international politics for years. I knew what national security advisors did. You know, they dealt with great powers like China and like Russia. They went to presidential meetings. I didn't expect that they stood at their desk one day to learn that a stateless group of terrorists had crossed from an ungoverned space called Afghanistan and spent less than $300,000 to bring down the Twin Towers and blow a hole in the Pentagon and kill nearly 3,000 people. And I didn't expect that suddenly those of us who were in a position of authority were going to face every day after September 11th as if it were September 12th. Every day, terrified of the next attack. Every day, wondering if we, the freest country on the earth, could survive and prosper in the face of this great evil. I will tell you that I needed my faith. I needed to call it out in prayer. I needed to share my need for it with other people who were God-centered. And thank God, I was in an administration with people who were. With President Bush, a man of great and deep faith. With John Ashcroft, the Attorney General. With Steve Hadley, my deputy. With Karen Hughes. With Harriet Myers, some of my best friends in the administration. We could therefore together practice our faith. Another important step on the road, as you engage your faith personally, you find that it is more and more important to practice it with people who also believe. And so I can remember prayers for the fallen, prayers for those who were in danger, prayers for those who had to make difficult decisions about life and death. One day on Air Force One, we suddenly realized that it was Palm Sunday. And we were on Air Force One on the way abroad. We weren't going to be able to go to church, something that I try routinely to do during Holy Week. And so we gathered everybody in the conference room, and we had a little service for Palm Sunday. And I thank the Lord that that was permitted on Air Force One. And then flying into Baghdad for Thanksgiving in 2003 with President Bush on a mission so secret because of security concerns that we didn't even say that the president was going to Baghdad. In fact, nobody knew until we were taking off from Baghdad because of the danger. I was sitting in the staff cabin with a few people, with Andy Card, the chief of staff, and Dan Bartlett, communications director, and Joe Hagan, the deputy chief of staff, and I said, as we were flying evasive moves, or the pilot was to prevent attack, I said, maybe we should go and pray with the president. And we did. And so to be in the company of those who were also God-centered was extremely important to getting through these times. But if I ever felt sorry for myself, I only had to do one thing, and that was to go to a place like Walter Reed or to Bethesda Naval Station Hospital and to realize that there were those for whom the sacrifice was so great, and yet they were meeting it with dignity, very often with prayerfulness, and always with determination and almost optimism about the future. And from that experience, I came home many a time and asked myself, was I that faithful? Did I really accept the central premise of our faith, as expressed in the Christian tradition by the Apostle Paul in Romans 5? Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. And not only that, we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Now hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who is given to us. And I would ask myself, do I accept that in perseverance we truly see the presence of God? That struggle is integral to a robust faith. That God doesn't promise to take away tribulations and trials, but rather promises to use them to walk alongside us so that we are affirmed even more in the power of our faith. Do we really believe the very paradox of our faith, that from the struggle on the cross would come redemption, that out of death comes life? Sometimes hard to actually say that it is a privilege to struggle. But indeed, it is a privilege to struggle. Because without struggle, we can come too easily to believe that we are capable on our own. We can put aside our faith because we're pretty good at managing this thing called life. But as Abraham Lincoln said in the depths of the Civil War, sometimes you have no other place to go but your knees. And thank God that we have the privilege to go to our knees in prayer. Sometimes this great paradox is best expressed in song. I am a musician, and I do love the great hymns. The strife is o'er, the battle is done. The victory of life is won. The sun of triumph has begun. Alleluia. So many times in our country and in our world, people have relied on going to their knees. They've relied on the privilege to struggle and to walk alongside God to be able to do unbelievably difficult things. In the founding of this country that should never have come into being, with a third of George Washington's troops down to smallpox on any given day, the founding fathers squabbling among themselves against the greatest military power of the time, but we did. In the Civil War, brother against brother, hundreds of thousands dead on both sides, but yet to emerge a more perfect union. In the passage west, to cross the continental divide in covered wagons, they had to be optimist and faithful. They didn't know where they were going, they kept going anyway. And in Birmingham, Alabama, the church bombings of that city, a place that would literally become known as Bombingham, a city so segregated that a little girl couldn't go to a restaurant with her family or to a movie theater, but her parents had her convinced she could become the President of the United States. She becomes the Secretary of State. Yeah, somehow unbelievable things. And as you reflect and I reflect on this great paradox, that out of struggle comes stronger faithfulness that then gives a foundation and a succor for further struggle and for greater faith until the day that we go home to be with the Lord. It is often the case that it is in the simplest of words that that paradox is understood and affirmed. As a little girl, my grandmother's favorite spiritual was "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen." And the words to that spiritual affirm this great paradox. I didn't really understand it at the time as a child, but I can remember time and time again over the last several years having it come back to me very powerfully. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows like Jesus. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory. Hallelujah. Thank you.